Hi, I'm Nancy Huntley. I'm here to welcome you all to Science Unwrapped on behalf of the College of Science, which sponsors these events. And I'll tell you a little bit about how they work and then introduce tonight's speaker. So here at Science Unwrapped, we always start with the presentation, and that'll be about 45 minutes. So we'll be in this room, and then when the presentation is over, we have time left for questions and answers. So when our speaker stops talking, we're not quite done yet. You'll have time to ask questions and hear answers. And then at about 8 o'clock, we'll stop in this room and we'll send you out into the hallways where there are lots of other scientists that have cool things to show you that you can play with and learn about and ask questions about. So that's how the program will work. We'll be in the room until 8 o'clock, and then there's another hour of fun. So our speaker tonight is Jim Lutz, Dr. Jim Lutz, who is a professor, a faculty member in the Department of Wildland Resources, and he's a forest ecologist. We usually tell you a little bit about people's paths to what they do now. Jim's path is a little different from what most ecologists have done. He began his career as a computer scientist and in business. So he has an undergraduate degree from Massachusetts Institute of Technology in electrical engineering, and then he has 2 master's degrees. One, a little quiet, please, just a little quiet. We got to talk less or we can't hear. My volume is too low? Well, it sure sounds loud up here. I'm sorry. So, are you with me so far? You know basically what's going to happen and that we're introducing Jim Lutz? You could hear that much? Yes. Okay. Jim got then degrees in computer science, where he studied artificial intelligence, and a master's in business administration. And he had a career in business for a while, doing big data sorts of analysis in finance, and worked primarily out of large cities like New York and London and Tokyo. And then he decided what he really wanted to do in life was to be part of environmental science, ecological science, and to work at a university where we try to do things to create opportunities for students to be able to do what they want to do and try to generate new knowledge and understanding, and at land-grant institutions like Utah State to share that with the public. So he left that job, went back to school, studied forest ecology, and 3 years ago came here to teach forest ecology. So he knows a lot about trees and forests, and especially about big trees, and that's what he'll talk about to you tonight.
All right, thank you very much, Nancy, and thank all of you for coming here to hear a little something about the forest and about the big trees. So, today I couldn't fit everything that we would want to hear about big trees into 45 minutes. So we're going to talk about a few things related to big trees, how they're unique and why they're important, both for forests and then also for us, for people. How have big trees influenced our society, and how do they continue to do that? So, you know, I'll have a lot of pictures of big trees, and everybody's seen large trees, but then I want to talk a little about just how big is a big tree. You know, so something about how much they weigh, how tall they are, so we get an idea of the range of sizes that we're talking about with big trees. And then finally, I want to talk about big trees around the world. So there are lots of different kinds of forests around the world, tropical forests and temperate forests, boreal forests, and to a certain extent, what is a big tree is a little different in those kinds of forests. But maybe there's some patterns. Maybe there's something about big trees around the world that's uniform, that's the same, that we can understand all big trees if we look at enough data from around the world. So that's mostly what we'll be talking about. There'll be a little bit of talk about implications for the future of big trees. So now I'll talk about a few things that show how big trees are important, in an ecological sense. So first, big trees really make the forest. They define the forest. If we go into a forest, it's the big trees that determine how tall the forest is. But more important than that, the big trees, the canopy trees that reach the largest sizes, they're the ones that are casting the most shade. They're changing the environment for all of the understory plants, the shrubs and herbs and smaller stature trees that would be in the forest. And the big trees perform an important function. So they make the environment under their canopy better, more conducive to other trees. The high temperature of the day is not as high in the middle of a forest. The low temperature of the night is not as low under big trees. Humidity is higher. And these characteristics of a forest make the forest environment one where different plants can grow. And it's these big trees at the top of the forest that are, to a great extent, controlling that environment and making it possible for these other plants to live. So when we walk into a forest, we should be able to immediately see the impact of big trees on the forest that we walk through today. But big trees are more important than what they're doing today for the forest. They're also incredibly important to the forest of tomorrow. And the reason for that has to do with seed production. All trees in the forest do not produce the same amount of seeds. Big trees produce much, much more. Many more cones, many more acorns, many more seeds. And I've got some pictures here that sort of illustrate that. The small inset picture is a subalpine fir from here in Utah, and it has one cone. It's a 6-foot tree that has one cone. That's actually unusual. Usually a 6-foot tree has no cones. But this one had one, so I took a picture of it. And now the larger picture is 200 feet up in a giant sequoia tree in California. And you can see all of these little green dots that are uncountable in this picture are this year's cone production from a giant sequoia. So even though these are different species, you can get the idea that small statured organisms, small trees, aren't contributing much to the next generation. They're concentrating on growing, getting big. But it's the trees that are already big that are allocating a lot of their energy to reproduction, to making seeds. And so those seeds are the ones that are tomorrow's forest, tomorrow's big trees. And it's better than that because, of course, the big trees, they're proven successful. They've been very successful in that environment. They've grown to a large size. It's very, very likely that their seeds are going to be very well suited to grow to large sizes in the future. So perhaps one of the most important aspects of big trees is that they control the future of the forest. They control the present and the future. And this phenomena where big trees contribute most of the seed output, is probably one of the factors, that leads to the development of forests with big trees. So that's sort of the direct importance of big trees to the forest. But there's some other real implications to big trees. Here are pictures of two forests in Washington and California. And big trees weigh a lot. Okay, all right, I know that's repeating the obvious there, but they weigh a lot, they have a lot of carbon in them. They sequester a lot of carbon. So in these times when we have more carbon in the atmosphere than we may have had for quite some time, these big trees take up a lot of that carbon and store it in the forest, so it is not in the atmosphere. Now, it might not be the very biggest trees that are taking up most of the carbon, but the large trees are taking up a high proportion of the carbon that the forest does take up. Now, here in the West, we actually have some of the heaviest forests in the world. So these Douglas fir forests and mixed conifer forests in California are actually two of the very, very heaviest forest types that cover, large areas. A lot of times people think it's the tropical forests that are heavy. And tropical forests have a lot of trees, and they can be very broad, but tropical trees are short. A tropical forest would be close to 100 feet in height, whereas these forests here, the forests in our western states, can be over 200 feet tall. So there's this extra height of the tree that can store all this carbon that smaller forests cannot store. So big trees are very, very important whenever we are considering the carbon that is stored in the forest or carbon uptake from the atmosphere. Okay, now there's another subtle and important process that are controlled by big trees. And this one we might not think about very often because when these trees are important is after they're dead. So the small picture on the left shows a forest 11 years after a very severe fire, and all of those big trees that you see in the picture are dead. And there are a lot of seedlings or saplings growing up among those dead trees. Now the next picture over shows a different forest, but shows a forest that's about 20 years old when all those young trees are really, really thick. They're all the same height. They're all very uniform. And what you can see in the picture is that one of these big dead trees has fallen through the forest. And it makes a pretty big hole. That's a 200-foot tree, probably about 5 feet in diameter, and it has just crushed all these trees. But what it has done is it started to create some variety in the forest. It started to create different kinds of structure. It's opened up the forest canopy. And you can see that same tree in the next picture to the right, almost 20 years later, and you can visually see in the picture that there are different kinds of trees growing in the place where that one big tree fell. And so these big trees that are standing and after they die and fall, they actually initiate an important process which generates variety in the forest, which is important to plant and animal species. And now the last picture on the right shows what happens, or what can happen, if you don't have any of that. The picture on the right is a forest that was, it's about 80 years old, pretty small trees for 80 years old, and it was logged in the middle of the last century and then burned twice. So not only were there no trees left standing, but there wasn't anything on the ground either. So what's happened is the forest has come in a very uniform manner and hasn't had anything that can sort of break it up, to give it a more variety of different habitats. And so it's only big trees that can really do this. It takes something very, very large to be able to create a big gap in the forest. And then another aspect, or a service, if you will, that big trees can provide is habitat. We have a lot of large vertebrates, birds and mammals, that require large habitat in the trees. And here's an example of a bird, the national bird, which builds a tremendous nest, which can only be supported by a very large tree. And then I'd like to turn our attention to other parts of the world. We don't have many heavy mammals that live in trees in North America, at least not on a permanent basis. But in most of the rest of the world, we have primates, some of them very large and very heavy, that live in the trees or spend a lot of their time in the trees and moving through the trees. And clearly these large primates wouldn't be able to do that if the forest was composed of small trees. It just wouldn't be big enough to support the primates or to support their locomotion as they jump from branch to branch through the trees. So these big trees are providing some unique habitat that is really required for a lot of organisms. Now, okay, it's even more than that. We think, okay, monkeys are flying through the trees, but big trees could have been important to making us human. Okay, I want to take you back to the shores of Lake Rusinga in Kenya 18 million years ago. It was a cool October night. Now, I don't know if it was a cool October night, but we do know it was 18 million years ago. And at that time, we had a pre-hominid, a very, very primitive primate called proconsul, which is shown to the left of the sort of evolutionary path there. So this is a long time before the development of Homo erectus. But anyway, we had this very primitive, small primate, and we know that this primate lived in savanna habitat, a generally open habitat with a few trees. But we also know that this primate lived in closed canopy forests. So those are really different, right? Closed canopy forest, big trees, lots of branches, and then open savanna, grassland with a few trees. So the environmental pressures in these areas are very different. The predators that proconsul had to watch out for are different. How proconsul would have to move would be very, very different. So it's hypothesized that the simultaneous occupancy of proconsul in savanna and in big trees contributed to the evolution of humans in two different ways. Contributed to the development of complex arms to swing through the trees, but perhaps more importantly, provided an evolutionary stimulus to developing better cognition, thinking more. We don't know too much about what happened with those primates back there on Lake Rusinga, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests that these big trees, were a driving force in the evolution of these primitive pre-hominids. So big trees, really, really important. We just didn't know. Okay, and then an obvious important aspect of big trees is sometimes you just need a big piece of wood. Little pieces of wood won't do. And this isn't really important now. We have a lot of different technology, different kinds of materials that we can use to build our structures. But if we think about the rise of civilization, if we think about how we got to this room, we needed a lot of big wood. The boats that brought most of our ancestors to North America from Europe used big wood, lots of pieces of big wood. The buildings we used to create used large timbers. It would have been impossible to do that without big trees. And furthermore, there's a phenomena about big trees that makes them even better for our human use. A lot of trees that grow to large sizes protect their wood. They have to protect their wood for hundreds of years against fungus, insects. So the wood is often of very, very high quality. Not always, but usually of high quality, which means if we use it in a structure or a boat, it's very persistent, lasts a long time. So the development of our civilization has really required, at times, these big pieces of wood from big trees. And then big trees also help us with history. It's really old trees help us with history. But a lot of times an old tree is a big tree and vice versa, not always. And so we can get information out of these big trees by taking cores. The picture under the text is increment cores showing the growth rates of trees year on year. And we can use this record that big old trees have to tell us about the past, to tell us about the climate of the past. So big trees not only have utility to us in terms of material products, but also in terms of information. And again, that's not a thing that we can look to small trees for. Okay, so I've talked about ecological aspects of big trees and some social aspects of big trees. But big trees have been more to us in the past. Big trees have been part of human spirituality and wonder for thousands of years. Okay, this is the sacred fig tree. This particular one is from Bodh Gaya in India. And this is the place where the Buddha was said to have achieved enlightenment under a large Bodhi tree or sacred fig. This isn't that tree, but every time a tree dies in this place, it's replanted with a descendant of the tree that the Buddha sat under. This sacred fig tree, this one species, is also venerated by the practitioners of Hinduism and Jainism. 22% of the population of this planet has a spiritual connection to this species of tree, which gets pretty big for its area. And and it's not just far afoot that people have looked at big trees, with a sense of religious awe. There are a number of animist practices, animist religions, such as Shinto in Japan or the Druids in England, that have venerated big old trees. Now, that's not so much the case, with Judaism or Christianity or Islam. The Abrahamic religions have usually taken to sort of discouraging animist practices, but still, even with Christianity, we still have some myths about the importance of trees. And one deals with the Glastonbury hawthorn in England. It is said, probably legend, that Joseph of Arimathea made his way from the Middle East to England. And he went to sleep on a hillside in Glastonbury, England, and laid his staff on the ground. When he awoke, the staff had grown into a special hawthorn, but it wasn't like normal hawthorns that bloom in the summer. This hawthorn bloomed in the summer and again at Christmas. So even, now that's a long way to walk for Joseph of Arimathea, but we still, many religions around the world have legends or stories or practices that relate to trees and to big trees. But we don't have to invoke religion to consider the awe that big trees have for all of us. We can just look to our American West. We can look to national parks that our country has established because of the awe we have for these big trees. The giant sequoia in Sequoia National Park, and the coast redwood in Redwood National Park. These trees are so large and so awe-inspiring that our forebears decided to preserve them so that their children and grandchildren would have the ability to sit under these large trees with the same awe that they had. So really, when we think about big trees, they've had this huge impact on us in a lot of different ways. So they've been important beyond their size, if you will. All right, so now we want to get into a few numbers here. A few numbers, and there will be a little bit of science. This is a science presentation. We're talking about big trees, so how big is a big tree? How big can a big tree get? So the biggest tree currently living is the General Sherman giant sequoia in Sequoia National Park. It's about 275 feet tall, and it weighs 2,000 tons. That's not the biggest tree that's ever existed, but it's pretty close, and it's the biggest one we think we have on the planet now. That's a big tree. Most of the trees, that we talk about as being large, are not of that kind of dimension. So I want to talk a little about what we mean by the size of a tree, and then give some examples, which are at the bottom of the slide. So when we talk about a tree and its size, we could talk about its height or its diameter, but usually we're talking about its weight, its mass, its biomass. And now this is there are a lot of different ways you can count how much a tree weighs. And if we think of a living tree, the live weight of a tree, like the 2,000 tons of the General Sherman, that includes all the water in the tree. And there's a lot of water in the tree and the leaves. So usually, because we want to compare trees, we will compare them based on the dry weight. And generally speaking, the dry weight is about half of the live weight. And then if we wanted to talk about carbon, about half of the dry weight of a tree is carbon. So, we have living weight, and then dry weight, and then carbon weight. So some examples from a particularly tall West Coast conifer, a sugar pine. A 2-foot in diameter tree, 60 centimeters, weighs a little less than 2 tons dry weight. That's not so much, right? 2 tons. But if we increase that tree to 4 feet in diameter, all of a sudden it weighs 10 tons because it's much taller and has much more wood up high. And then if we increase a tree of that species from 4 feet to 5 feet, it will weigh almost 20 tons dry. Now that's assuming that the top's not broken off and it has a relatively standard configuration. But we can see that if we're talking 3, 4, 5 foot trees, that's a lot of weight. So that's what when we're talking about size, we're talking about weight. But now we still have to define big trees, okay? So how should we define it? Yeah. So when we're talking about big, we have to be comparing with something that is little. So what we're really talking about is resource inequality. We're trying to understand how much of the resource, how much of the carbon the big trees have as compared to the little trees. So resource inequality, and resource inequality just means that a small number of the individuals have the most resources. And which trees have all the carbon? That's what we want to know. So now in the natural world, we think about this a little differently than we may, in a social context. So does anybody remember Occupy Wall Street? Occupy Wall Street a few years ago? Right. A bunch of people were concerned about resource inequality in our society, by which they meant like the 1% have got this huge amount of money. And so they were protesting that resource inequality. So we have the 1% in natural systems, and it has some concentrated amount of resources that we don't know, but we don't necessarily think that's a bad thing in a forest. But you can see that big tree would be part of the 1% of that forest, and it's clearly got a lot more resources than the small tree. And I don't know if they're organizing a protest or not, but yeah, okay. So what is a big tree? We keep coming back to this. All right, well, first, if you look at forests worldwide, you can say trees sort of start to get big at 2 feet in diameter. And we could use that. It's a good number. But that number doesn't account for fundamental differences in forests. There are forests, northern forests or forests growing on poor soils where, the trees just don't get that big. But certainly all forests have a 1%. There's a 1% of the largest trees, and all forests have. You know, when you have 100 trees, there's a 1 percentile. So that's sort of a relative measure that we can use to examine forests. But we can also turn that around, and we can say, we can use some things we know about forests to determine sort of the important big ones. So usually, you know, the number of trees decreases with diameter, as I've illustrated with this triangle here. So you have a large number of small trees, and as the size gets larger, there's a smaller number of individuals. And then the weight of the trees is the opposite. You know, little trees, you know, even 1,000 little trees just don't weigh anything, right? Whereas one of those really big sugar pines, right, 5-foot sugar pine, you know, we're talking 20 tons here. So the biomass of the forest, or the weight of the forest, sort of follows the second triangle that popped up. Okay, so what we can do with that is we can introduce a concept, which I'm calling the large diameter threshold. And there's some diameter for every forest where half of the biomass is composed of a large number of very small trees, and half of the biomass is a small number of very heavy trees. I hope I said that right. But you can see the line there, you know, it's drawn about right. We see the bright green triangle showing that there's a small number of trees at those large diameters, and sort of the faded green triangle is showing that that's the place where biomass is half. And you know, if we have a forest and we have half of the function controlled by a small number of individuals, we might really want to pay attention to those individuals, those few, those elite. But this also gives us a way to compare forests around the world that have different kinds and sizes of trees. So with a large number of colleagues, we took a look at that. And we looked at forests from all over the world, the places in red, and we looked at large forest plots. These are plots where every tree is identified and we know what it is, so we can figure out how much it weighs. 48 of these plots around the world. We analyzed 5,474,000 trees. Right, that's a lot of trees. Those trees know what they're talking about. Okay? And so we looked at them to see if there were patterns worldwide of large diameter trees and what this might mean for the future of forests, you know, in the human era. So I've got some slides that'll be a result of this research, and you'll notice at the bottom there'll be 4 pictures that illustrate some of the 48 plots. So you can just get an idea for the kinds of forests that we're looking at and how forests can vary around the world, but then also how they can be the same. Okay, so what we really found in this environment, in this study, was that if we were to take out large trees, large diameter trees, the forest just wouldn't be the same. The concentration of resources in those large trees, you know, is really high. So we found that all over the world, generally, depending on your definition, there are few large diameter trees. They're not regularly spaced. And we all know this if we walked around a forest, but there are patches of big trees and patches with no big trees. So just that irregularity is setting up, you know, really different kinds of habitat within the forest. But one of the things we found, the things we wanted to know is how much resource really does the 1% control? And in these 48 forest types, the 1% controls half of the carbon. I mean, occupy the forest, right? I mean, half of the carbon. That's a huge amount of resource inequality, pointing out the fact that those 1% of the trees do have a tremendous importance. Okay, now some of the other things we found, there's only 3 graphs, right? So rest easy on this. Okay, this graph shows on the y-axis biomass, or the weight of the forest. And the x-axis shows the large diameter threshold, right? It's the place that divides half of the biomass, the big ones and the little ones. And this is worldwide. Latitude is in color. So you can see there's not necessarily a real trend in this in latitude. But what we can see is the only way for a forest to be heavy, to sequester a lot of carbon, is through big trees. You can't do it with a lot of medium-sized trees, at least not on this planet. So if we want a heavy forest, we need to do it with big trees. Okay, this graph also shows the large diameter threshold on the x-axis. The y-axis is, the y-axis is the same, how heavy the forest is. The x-axis is large diameter richness. Okay, now if we compare forests around the world, some have 20 species of trees and some have 1,000. So what we do is we look at the big trees and we say, well, how many species of big trees are there? And then what is the proportion? So if we have a forest with 1,000 different species and 20 of them reach, the size of large diameter for that forest, then that would be a large diameter richness of, 2%. Very, very small number. So what we see from this graph is that heavy forests don't have very many species that reach large sizes. So it's not like everybody wants to be big, but all the tree species in the forest can't do that. A smaller number can do that. And if we have a heavy forest, the proportion of species, that can be big is smaller. Now in the tropics, that still can be a lot of species, 30 or 40 species. But in the temperate zone, we might have a very small absolute number of species which can reach this large size. So here in the western forests, maybe 3 or 4 species in any of the forests in the west have the potential to reach very large sizes, which isn't very many. So the third and final graph is showing resource concentration. How much biomass does that 1% really have? And this one just shows it with latitude. Tropical forests are reddish, temperate and boreal forests are greenish. And what this is showing is there's a huge amount of resource concentration in tropical forests. Those big trees contain so much of the biomass. And you can see it, the picture here of Ituri, there's like two real trees in that picture, and everything else is these little stems. So these little stems aren't really contributing to the biomass of the forest or maintaining the microenvironment or the shade. It's all about these really big trees. So yeah, the 1%, in these forests can be as much as 80% of the biomass. So imagine what would happen if we just went in and cut down those 1% because they were a particularly valuable timber species. Be some big changes. So one of the things we can do is we know, since big trees are so important, if they were to go away, there would be big changes in the forest. And especially if there weren't many trees that could be big, there might be a big change from just a small perturbation that killed off one species. So if we had an introduced disease that killed a big tree, like think about the chestnut blight on the East Coast, in the 1900s, that could have a huge effect on the forest, and it did. Or if we removed big species because they have, a lot of timber value, and a lot of that's going on in Southeast Asia right now, where there's a lot of economic incentive to cut down some of those big trees. But we just can't assume that the forest is going to continue without those individuals or those species. So big trees are important to forests. lots of different ways. Important to us as people. Now, I'll say this, it should go without saying, but it's sometimes the most obvious things in ecology or forestry that get missed. It takes a long time to grow a big tree. A big tree requires good conditions for hundreds of years. Sure, sometimes they can grow very quickly, but in a forest situation, it's centuries to develop for one of these big trees to grow from nothing. So, if something happens to big trees in a forest, it's going to take a long time before the full functions of that forest are restored. The trees that are ameliorating the environment, the trees that are creating the snags, the trees that are creating big logs. All of that takes a lot of time for those trees to grow and then for those trees to continue to function after they die. So, where does that leave us with the big trees? Big trees have been with us, since Lake Rusinga, 18 million years ago. They've come with us as we colonized North America, and they came with us as we settled the West. Big trees have been integral and absolutely integral part of our human journey. So what can we learn from the big trees? There's some science and some graphs, but beyond that, the big trees have something to teach us. Foremost, big trees should remind us of the power of an individual to make a difference. They are majestic, elite, but hundreds of years ago, they were just like all the other saplings in the forest. Big trees have character. Big trees endure. We would be lucky if we could each be like a big tree. And because of the respect that we should show their stature and their many long years, we should be sure that there is always some place where the big trees can grow. And as we take up the threads of our normal life, I think for all of us, at least sometime, we should ask ourselves, is what I am doing good for the big trees? Thank you very much. I'm certainly happy to take big questions. Yeah.
So a lot of the big trees on the West Coast are what I would call evergreens. Is there anything inherent about them that thrive as big trees?
Well, that's an excellent question, and there's a lot of reasons for evergreenness. Evergreenness, has evolved many times, among the plants. Now, the specific reason that the California and Washington plants are probably evergreen is so they can photosynthesize deep into the winter. So the climate is very mild on the Pacific slope. Even if there's snow, it's still not that cold. And the idea is that evergreenness helps those trees photosynthesize. In February, if it warms up for a week, they can do that. And in fact, we do know that they photosynthesize throughout the winter, and that's undoubtedly helping them reach large sizes. What? I'll go with that one first, way back.
How does an organism like Pando fit in the big tree? Because it's arguably a big tree, right?
Well, perhaps I should have talked about that. When I was talking about big trees all tonight, I meant trees where all of the growing tissue is still present. So Pando, an aspen is a clonal species. So we think the clone, a lot of these clonal trees, is tremendously old, thousands and thousands of years. And if we were to take all the stems and weigh them, it would be some huge amount of mass. But the clonal species don't fit into, a nice little box. And until recently, it was actually very hard to tell where the edge of the clone was. So what I was talking about in terms of big trees really referred to sort of single stem, non-clonal species. What?
Now how much does that big tree weigh?
Which one?
The big one that we were talking about.
The really big one, 2,000 tons.
Now how much is it?
How old? We don't know exactly because it's too big to figure out. We think it's about 3,000 years old. Those are great questions. Yeah.
Like, how do apples, like they're green and then they turn into red?
Well, the fruit. My dean is laughing. Well, when seeds and fruits ripen, they go through transformation of the chemicals that are in them, and the change in color lets us know they're ripe, but more importantly, it lets other animals know they're ripe. So that maybe birds or maybe monkeys want to keep track of the color so that they know it's ripe and they can eat it. Because then those birds and animals will carry the seeds to someplace else to grow another tree. Yeah. Well, there are more trees in the tropical areas, and a lot of tropical trees tend to weigh more because their wood is very heavy, but they're still short. So the heaviest trees are actually the ones in the temperate forests, like in California or Washington. Now, because it's wet and warm in the tropics, the trees can grow very, very quickly every year, but also the enemies, the fungus and the insects, they also work faster in the tropics. So trees die more often, so they might not live to be quite as old. A waving hand right there. Say again, please. Oh, redwood. Well, a redwood that's 100 years old is just a baby. They can grow very fast. A 100-year-old redwood that's growing in really good conditions, can be almost 3 feet in diameter. But we would say it probably wouldn't make a lot of cones. And there'll be some cones in the hallway afterwards. It probably wouldn't make a lot of cones until it was at least 100 or maybe 150 years old. And the really, really big redwoods that you see in the park are all more than 1,000 years old. Yeah, in the striped shirt. Yes? Well, the oldest living single tree, so not an aspen clone, that we know of is the bristlecone pine. And the oldest one lives in California. It's about 4,845 years old. And there might be one that's older. People are still counting, though. So that's a species that grows very, very slowly, but lives a long time. 5,000 years, a single tree has stood in the mountains. Yeah. So many hands. Yes?
How does a tree make
Well, everything starts from the tree leaves, right? And the trees do photosynthesis, and they make sugars. And you can think of the sugars kind of like money in the bank. So a tree takes those sugars and then makes more complex chemicals out of it, the chemicals that are in the sap. Of course, most of the sap is water. It comes from the ground, but the tree will always be adding chemicals that it made following the photosynthesis that it did in the leaves. Yes?
So you convinced me that big trees are really important. Are we doing enough to protect big trees in the U.S. globally?
Well, I mean, it sort of depends on the place that we are. So in the West, most of the low elevation big trees were logged out, with the original settlement of the West. And right now, the low elevation big trees, there's under 5% of the number that were here at the beginning of Euro-American settlement. So that's a lot less. So we have a lot less of these old forests doing old forest things. In some parts of the world, there are large parts of the forest that have not yet been disturbed, and they have all of their big trees. But in those parts of the world, the tropics, a lot of the big trees are being selectively logged because they have such great wood value. Personally, I would say that we probably don't want to be losing a lot more big trees than we've already lost. But many of these species that grow to large sizes are very vigorous. And, it's not like Douglas fir is going to go extinct. But we definitely have a lot less of those big ones than we did 100 years ago. Yeah. Well, okay, that's a really good question, and it's also a lot of work. You cut it down. Well, you can do it when it's standing or when it's cut down, and you take pieces of the tree, you take pieces of the bark, and pieces of the outside wood, and pieces of the inside wood, and pieces of the branches, and pieces of the leaves, and you dry all those things, get rid of the water, and you figure out how much each of the individual components weigh, and then you figure out what the volume was for the whole tree. And you multiply and add the parts together. But if you want to get a good sample of, for example, how much the wood weighs, what's the wood density, you have to take a lot of pieces. You have to take some from the bottom and the middle and the top, because the density might be a little different at different heights, and it is. And so that's to figure out exactly how much plants weigh, the part above ground and the part below ground, is something that we're working on very, very hard, because it's really hard to do. And there's still a big uncertainty in it. Way in the back.
What's the average girth of a tree?
Well, as you could see from the graph of sort of the large diameter threshold, it varies around the world. So for example, in the data that we looked at today, a forest in Taiwan that has trees that could grow to be 3 feet or more in diameter is really, really small because it keeps on getting hit by typhoons. So when we talk about the average girth of a tree, there's what the individual species, what an individual of a species could do, what it does in the forest, and then what it does when the forest is in a particular place. But certainly the average size by number of trees would be really, really small, because most trees in forests are small trees. Average size of all the trees in those 48 plots is definitely less than a foot. But some really patient person in the very back.
Currently they use GMOs for food and resources like that. Are there currently developing any GMOs for trees to help resilience against termites or other such bugs? Or, as you mentioned, there's trees going extinct and trees growing different bees.
Well, there is some research into GMO trees, but a lot of that research has been, what could a modified tree do for us that's different from what a regular tree could do? So one example is GMOs attempting to they actually insert bunny liver genes into trees to help remediate soil. Mammalian livers are very good at breaking down chemicals, and the idea is that if you could put this into a tree and it could send its roots down into contaminated soil, maybe it could break up those contaminants. But generally, genetically modified trees is not really, it's not a very popular thing. The genome is very complicated on a lot of these trees, which may be part of it. Trying to do a GMO, a genetically modified organism that's a tree, carries with it all the usual difficulties that the development of GMOs have. Yeah. All the way back. Say again, please. Well, the oldest one would probably be the Jardine juniper. And that's another one we don't really know how old it is until it dies. Up Logan Canyon, there are, good, so second growth examples of Douglas fir or limber pine up at the Limber Pine Trail. That would be about as big as trees would get here. Many of the larger trees, were logged off, during the original settlement of Cache Valley. So we don't really have any of, the big straight ones left. But certainly a lot of the non-merchantable ones, any of the trails up Logan Canyon, I think you could find some good ones. Okay. Yeah, that's you're right in that you need samples of the tree, and you can get the samples in lots of different ways. So you can put the increment corer, the borer in, and that will give you a sample. But that's a very small sample. If you wanted to figure out how much the tree weighed, you'd probably just want more. You'd want more wood, so you could get a better idea. But you're absolutely right that the principle is you're going to take a small sample, measure it really exactly, and then multiply it out by the size of the whole tree.
So maybe one last question in here.
Okay.
So how do big trees tend to allocate their resources? Is it more towards the fecundity or more towards the survival? And then along with that, do big trees tend to be more simultaneous or gregarious, or does it depend more on the species?
Well, there's a lot of species difference, but one thing that big trees have to do is they're big, which means they have a lot of sapwood, they have a lot of roots, they have a lot of non-photosynthetic parts, and they have to keep that alive. So the amount of photosynthesis they have to do just to break even is a pretty large amount. But that being said, some of them have an awful lot of leaves. So a lot of them do have the ability to allocate to reproduction. And if they are tall, there's no particular reason for them to get taller, no competitive reason. And they might not be able to get taller if they're already really tall. but I think their past ability to compete in the forest and establish the position that they have often gives them this extra ability to allocate to reproduction. Okay,
So please, if you still have questions, you can stay and come down and ask Jim, and otherwise head out into the halls, and let's thank Jim for a great talk.